The context of disaster. In Thai children's stories and fables, cheats usually prosper. Apparently because they're considered more clever than those they cheated, and this cleverness is seen as the more desirable virtue. I found this worrying and counterintuitive, and wrong. I wanted my son Louis to have a more rounded moral education than he was getting from entirely Thai sources, so I'd started to take him to church in the August of 2004. My reckoning being that even though I was forced to go to church as a child, the values I'd absorbed there and at Catholic school must have been a huge part of the morality I eventually developed, and as an adult, being an old school lefty, I thought I'd turned out okay. I'm known for being caring and compassionate, sensitive, occasionally wise, and having a generosity of spirit that's common to most people who are attracted to my former profession of nursing. So that's the context. Here's how it rolled out. On December the 26th, 2004, at 9:10 a.m, having kissed my sleeping partner and son, I left the house alone and headed for Sunday Mass at the Sheraton Hotel in the Laguna complex, about 5 minutes' drive away. Despite my rationale regarding Louis' moral education, I'd actually begun to get something out of going to church. I liked the rituals. They were familiar to me. They reminded me of another time. I remained an atheist, but there was something about all of that. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was a time to think about my grandmother, who, church was really important to. My mum, not so much, but, she was happy when I went. It kept my gran off her back, I think. So, anyway, I'd started to go and get something out of it. We'd had a heavy Christmas day and evening. The bedroom when I woke up stank of exhaled beer and spirits. It had been that sort of Christmas day, like a lot of folks. During these very moments on Maicao Beach, about 15 minutes north of Laguna, a 10-year-old British girl called Tilly Smith was remembering a project she'd done at school 2 weeks earlier. The subject was tsunamis. She told one newspaper later,
"I was on the beach and the water started to go funny. There were bubbles and the tide went out all of a sudden. I recognized what was happening and had a feeling there was going to be a tsunami. I told Mummy."
Her mother believed her instantly, and quick action by her and the Thai hotel staff meant Maicao Beach was quickly cleared just minutes before a huge wave crashed ashore. That beach was one of the few on the Thai island of Phuket where no one was killed. To get to the Sheraton, I had to drive first towards and then around a lagoon. The cassette in the car had been broken for months, but this had not stopped me from providing live in-car entertainment by singing. I was singing Without You by The Cure. It was that sort of glorious morning. At the other end of the lagoon, there was a shallow dune that separated it from the beach. The whole length of the lagoon lay between me and the dune, and looking straight ahead, I saw first beach furniture, and then people washed up into the air, over the dune, and into the lagoon. Immediately, dozens of people came running towards the car and away from the beach, some clearly injured. Many of them were gesturing, "Turn around." One guy on a motorbike who had a large gash on his head said in broken English, "You go now, sir. Too dangerous." The sir seems so out of context, but he was hotel staff. Their job depends on calling everybody foreign sir. I was still trying to process what I'd seen, waiting for the instant replay or the pundits to explain it to me. My first thoughts were about a bomb. Since Bali, we knew that Phuket could be a likely target. Everybody kind of expected a bomb, if it came, to be in the packed streets of Patong. The Laguna area in the north of the island is reserved for the well-heeled Euro-bourgeoisie, staying in one of the 5 very good yet utterly charmless hotels in the Laguna complex. The other Western residents of this area were dozens of expatriate tax exiles who bought one of the $1 million homes that were being built in a frenzy by anyone with enough capital and the balls to build anything in Thailand. The people living there, the people who bought those houses, were mostly European nouveau riche from the former British, French, Belgian and Dutch colonies of Asia. Pre-bubble dot-com dudes, Hong Kong bankers, like most people I've used this term as rhyming slang, usually to describe those very people, speculators, entrepreneurs, bean counters, international lawyers, and a smattering of good old-fashioned old money. I don't expect most listeners to be endeared by that introduction to this little privileged community. But later, when you learn of their deeds, you will know that the humble amongst us do not have a patent on integrity, character, compassion, or bravery. At the insistence of the last person to tell me to get out of there, I turned the car and picked up my mobile. I called a friend who had a house close to the beach. Bear in mind that none of us knew it was a tsunami at this point. This is a real-time account. We had no name for our pain until several hours later. I called a friend, Mike Hosking, who lived nearby, to see if he knew what was happening. No answer, so I called his wife, Rona. She answered and I said, "Something bad has happened on the beach. There are injured people everywhere. I don't know what it is, but I'd get out of the house if I were you." Rona replied that there'd been an earthquake in Sumatra and we pondered whether we'd had one too. She said her husband had been up early to go on a bike ride and thought he felt something. I tried calling a few more people, but ominously the phones were down. I managed to get through to my Thai partner, Sawapa, and told her to get ready to get out of the house, and also to turn on the Thai TV news to try and find out what had happened. In the 5 minutes it took me to get to the house, ex-Hong Kong copper Graham Bowen was screaming at his wife Liz to get out of the water, and they ran for their lives with the wave on their heels to safety. A few hundred yards down from them, members of management from an international chain of hotels were fleeing without warning their guests nor returning to help. Some of their guests didn't make it. Nobody talks about it. Maybe we shouldn't. Anders Bang Eriksson, on holiday in Khao Lak in the mainland, was trying to hold on to his 2.5-year-old son, little Ragnar. He had to change the arm that was holding him, and Ragnar was torn away. As he floated further and further from his desperate father, Ragnar's last words were, "Daddy, I'm scared." Ragnar's mother was being swept 2 kilometres inland. Anders hopelessly watched 2 other small blonde children drown. He was utterly unable to help them, as he was pressed by debris against the same tree. He sank below the rising wave and took 3 gulps of salt water and prepared to die. And then a hand plunged into the water and pulled him into a boat. Well-loved expatriate animal lover Leonie Cousins was headed towards her beach house in the south of the island to warn her house guests that something was wrong. She didn't make it. Resident Aussie and upmark gym manager Peter Heppel was struggling for life in an underground supermarket, knowing that his new baby was probably drowned. In the same supermarket basement, Louise Wilgrass lay dead. Her husband and 3 children were trapped in their car that had been washed up an alley as they waited for her outside the supermarket. All the cars in front of them and behind them had been smashed into buildings, killing many of the people in both the cars and in some of the buildings. Norwegian Jeanette Teagland was wondering where her husband and 2 little girls were. They'd gone to the beach to buy postcards, but had been gone a long time. Kun Thorn, a local businessman in Khao Lak, was making the heartbreaking decision whether to save his staff. He could reach them without endangering his own life, or his 8-year-old son, whom he couldn't. Frau Frieda Baumer held tightly onto her 68-year-old husband, whose head was trapped beneath the water. She managed to drag him by the hair up enough for him to grasp a desperate breath, which allowed him to live. For another 5 days, anyway. Guy Chambers opened his beachfront room door, only to be thrown back into the room by the power of the wave. catching one last glance of his beautiful Japanese girlfriend's face. He would only ever see her again in his dreams. On Phi Phi Island, a Swedish mother had to decide which of her toddlers to save. Afterwards, when she was asked about this, she chose the youngest, as the eldest had the best chance of survival on his own. In the grotesquely unreasonable theft of life in the 30 minutes it took for the waves to do their worst, over 7,000 people were killed in our immediate area, and thousands more were injured. When I got to the house a few minutes later, everyone was doing things in Thai time, a bit slower than one would ideally want in an emergency. So I became shouty man. It's my job. Everyone smiled and carried on at the same pace. This is a war I always lose, and so I switched on the TV and waited for Sawapa to do whatever it is she does that means we can't leave the house for at least an hour after having decided that this is what we were going to do. There had been a tsunami warning in Phuket a few years before, 1998. I remembered that during that warning we'd been told to go to the highest point on the island, a hill in the middle of the commercial capital of the island, Phuket City, known as Sapan Hin, Stonebridge Hill. That warning in 98 was treated by many people as a joke. The Thai meteorological officer who had issued that warning, a Mr. Samith, was promptly retired, sacked, and lambasted by his employers and publicly ridiculed by a media who tried to allege ridiculously that he was trying to destroy the tourism on behalf of, I don't know, Singapore, Malaysia tourism. If only is part of the language of this disaster. I am sure the chilled dish of revenge he was served by this tsunami did not make it an enjoyable feast. It was the fate and humiliation of this man that his successor clearly had in mind when he did not issue a tsunami warning when he knew that the wave was possible, 2 hours before it washed ashore. If only. Part 2. We are the news. As I drove the 5 kilometres towards the hill, I was being overtaken by ambulances and cars waving the red rag from their windows. Having lived in Asia for a few years, I knew this to be a sign indicating that they were taking injured people to the hospital. I dropped off the family at the Hilltop restaurant. It was already full of people who had the same idea as us, and I made my way back down the hill. I got to Phuket International Hospital at the foot of the hill about 15 minutes after I saw the wave land at Laguna, and the reception was already swarming with people. I looked for Peter Davidson, the hospital administrator, and a good mate, and I couldn't find him. So I just pitched in where I could. Some minor dressings and a lot of translating. I speak German, French and Thai, and this seemed to be the most useful thing I could do. Although I am a doubly qualified registered nurse, I had never worked in an A&E department except a placement during my training. Sure, I shared the basic skills, resuscitation, dressing techniques and general first aid, but most of my career in the UK had been spent in palliative care, the only exception being the time I spent in Calcutta, at Telepark Children's Clinic for the amazing Dr. Jack Prager, prior to coming to Thailand. Palliative care is the support of those who are terminally ill and their families until the illness reaches its final conclusion. These skills seemed to be redundant in this situation, and I left the Thai nurses who were way more competent than me in this situation to get on with it. All the initial injuries seemed to be cuts to lower legs, some quite severe in depth and scale. From conversations with the people I was treating and translating for, a picture of what happened had formed. The sea had gone out quickly and returned at a thunderous pace, knocking people over, smashing windows and trashing cars. Most of the people were being brought in from Patong, and this made sense as it has the biggest population on the island. The hospital was coping splendidly, and I thought of getting the family and going home. I tried to get a hold of Peter again, but to no avail, so I walked across the exit of the A&E department. When I got there, I saw a queue of assorted vehicles trying to get into the hospital. It was a random assortment, from tuk-tuks to motorbikes with sidecars, jeeps, cars and buses, each one carrying injured people. The first serious injury I saw was a young man in his 20s with a horrendous crush fracture to his leg. It was almost squashed flat. He was one of the first of hundreds of amputations in those first few days. He was white as a sheet. He was accompanied by two friends who looked utterly shell-shocked. Similar, hollow, pleading and uncomprehending eyes were cast towards me 1,000 times over the next week. It's a haunting and questioning look, as unmistakable as the smell of death. Once you know it, you can never forget it. I will always recognize it again, immediately. I saw the same wretched look several months later in the TV coverage following the London bombings and every subsequent tragedy since. I still don't know the question they ask, nor the answer required. Walking around the large waiting room of the hospital, I saw many more injured arrive on stretchers and makeshift versions of stretchers. As the minutes ticked by, each car delivered people who were more seriously injured than the last. I looked up at the TV screen in the waiting room. I was stood next to an Aussie guy, and we were both trying to get a grip on what had happened. We asked the secretary nearby to change the channel to BBC or CNN. Those channels were still reporting the Sumatran undersea earthquake and, briefly, paying it little attention. The Aussie guy turned to me and said, "You know what, mate? We are the news." We were indeed the news, and most people who have been in a similar situation will confirm. What we believe to be up-to-the-minute news, unless it occurs in a big capital city full of film crews, is typically hours behind a breaking story. It's not a criticism, it's just a fact. We were alone. The world didn't know what had happened, and there had been a second, much more lethal wave. We were in the shit, frankly. Part 3, a reunion. Most will have seen the subsequent TV footage of the wave and now know that it's not a Hollywood-style crested giant smashing all asunder. A tsunami is a stealthier assassin, its power deceptively hidden by its out-of-character experience. Like electricity or gas, one could not see its true intent and menace, but enough of it is certainly lethal. The tsunami killed by its relentless speed, bulk, duration and surprise. If only we had removed the last of these elements, it wouldn't have been so deadly. Just destructive to property. If only. Anything travelling at 40 kilometres an hour will cause you damage when it hits you. The tsunami was travelling at 40 kilometres an hour when it landed. It is a vast, seething, surging, bubbling, irresistible mass, and people have described a terrifying whooshing sound as it approached, a sound not unlike that of an underground train appearing from a tunnel to the platform. Many also describing a strong wind that preceded the wave. It did not have to be Hollywood tall. It had enough power to tear steel, uproot trees, and tear concrete walls down, tossing cars and buses around like toys in a bathtub as it passed. Its momentum picked up the debris it had created with each car, piece of glass, lump of concrete, television, or uprooted tree was turned into a weapon of utter destruction. It was this debris that caused many of the fatalities and horrendous injuries that made me conclude a few days later, rightly or wrongly, that by comparison, those who drowned had a peaceful passing. The hospital was getting busier with uninjured people too. By noon, the waiting room was full of what looked like refugees. Dishevelled, damp, bruised and bandaged men and women of all nationalities, all of them with a single purpose: to find someone they had been separated from. It became apparent the palliative care skills I had may actually be of some value in the next few days, and heartbreaking though it is to say it, I was right. I sat next to an old guy who was so traumatized he couldn't tell us who he was. I tried my best in several languages to reach him, but he just stared straight ahead. I guessed he was in his 70s. He was a little banged up, but nothing obviously life-threatening. He had been bandaged and sat down with a sweet drink, a standard treatment for shock. It would be several days later before he could bring himself to speak, and this was nothing to do with my efforts. An Irish family had been brought to the hospital, mum and dad and 4 kids, aged 8 to 14 years old. The father had a bad injury to his leg and required surgery and hospitalisation. The rest of the family set up camp in the waiting room and very quickly began to comfort and support the other victims. The kids sat with this man constantly, talking to him, making sure he ate, asking for his name or nationality or next of kin at all times of the day and night. His reunion came about a week later after he started talking to the kids. They discovered his name and nationality, and when his daughter from Australia came to get him, she could not thank them enough for their help. Most reunions I saw came in the following 3 days. Most actually on the very first day. In that waiting room, the howls of those who had feared the worst as they set their eyes on their wife or husband, fiancé, friend, child, sounded the latest piece of good news. It is not a sound of joy, and I cannot describe the noise, but I can attempt to give a sense of what it's like to hear it. It's a howl from deep within, a guttural animal outburst that almost compels you to join in. It brought instant tears to my eyes, and I was not struck by the happiness of the reunion, but by the sadness of everything else. It was an horrific moment, devoid of beauty or happiness. An older Scandinavian couple walked across the room towards each other, red-faced and tears streaming down their cheeks, passing everyone as though they didn't exist, shouting each other's names until they could finally touch each other. The man held his wife's face in his hands and his whole body quaked. She kissed his forehead and said his name, again and again and again, and he said hers. It was hard to watch, not embarrassing, hard. A moment too private and too intimate to witness. They didn't care. The veneer of convention was rendered trivial by the power of their reunion. They had both just come back from the dead, and there's no etiquette that covers this event. I knew from my previous work in palliative care that there's nothing more real than death, nothing that focuses the mind so sharply, nothing that sorts out your priorities more effectively. When someone close is dying, all is typically forgiven, and so it should be. I sometimes feel it is the duty of those who know that they are dying to forgive everyone. I've seen families that were torn apart 30 years ago, usually over something utterly trivial like money or dating someone out of their expectations or convention or whatever, reunited and forgiven on a deathbed. And I can tell you, those people do go gently into that dark night, contented. Clearly, Dylan Thomas was an arrogant drunk who knew nothing about the reality of one's own demise. There is nothing heroic in the quality of death. I want to go gently too. The Scandinavian couple were changed forever, and their future would involve a massive readjustment in what was important. Possessions would be shown for their actual value, for they had lost and found each other. And that's all that matters, isn't it? So many people in the following weeks had to go through this process. Most used some lines I'd heard before from the dying. I had cherished them for a long time and tried always to live up to them. We are not our cars, nor our houses, nor our postcode, nor our jewellery. We are the people who love us, the adventures we have, and the stories we can tell. I was painfully aware that each reunion was a bitter pill for those who saw it and were still waiting. If only their loved one would walk in, crawl in, be carried in, intact, crushed, disabled, unconscious, in a coma, at least alive. We'll work out the rest afterwards, make adjustments. It'll be okay. Just be alive. Just be found now. As the days went by, these desires and expectations were adjusted according to each person's ability to grasp the truth of the situation. Their ability to take each sad step on the path to the reality that the likelihood of their loved one being found alive decreased with each hour.